Our speaker today is Jim Otteson. I'm proud to tell you that Jim comes to us from the land of the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. Come on now. I know there are a lot of deacons out there. It's a typical response. Deacons are always controlled, self-controlled, modest, understated. All right. Reminds me of a Wake Forest football game. Right, Jim?
A lot of golf.
Yeah. All right. Dr. James Otteson is Professor of Economics and the Thomas Smith Presidential Chair in Business Ethics at Wake Forest University. Jim received his undergraduate degree from Notre Dame. There's some football for you. And his PhD from the University of Chicago. He specializes in political economy, the history of economic thought, and business ethics. Jim's books have included Adam Smith's Marketplace of Life, Actual Ethics, and The End of Socialism, all three of those published by Cambridge. His most recent books are The Essential Adam Smith, published by Fraser, and Honorable Business, a new framework for business in a just and humane society. And this book is forthcoming from Oxford. Jim is married to Katie. He has 4 children. One's still at home, so he's almost a free man. The title of Jim's presentation today is The Moral Case for Capitalism. You're likely aware of the fact that capitalism is often treated unkindly on many college campuses these days. Thanks to the leadership of Dr. Otteson and many others, I'm proud to say, as an alum of Wake Forest, that Wake is leading the charge in offering students the opportunity to learn about the tremendous contribution that free markets and capitalism have made to progress and wealth in the world today. Please join me in welcoming Jim Otteson.
Thank you very much, Benton. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see if the clicker works for us. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you, President Mike, and ladies and gentlemen of the audience. So I have 2 hours to speak. Is that what it was? So Benton asked me to speak about, so this title actually comes as a suggestion from Benton, The Moral Case for Capitalism. As you know, professors sometimes worry about offending our students. Students get offended at a lot of things, and I like to say that I feel as though it's my professional duty as a professor to offend my students every day, so I do my best. So, what I would like to do today is to make what I think is I'm going to make what I think is the strongest case I can make in a few minutes here for capitalism, with the hope of provoking or maybe even offending some of you. And we'll give a chance for questions at the end of it. There we go. So the first question to begin with is, why would anybody support a commercial society? What do critics have to say? Now, I'm not probably telling you anything you don't know or haven't heard, but here are a few things that critics say about capitalism, what they say about market-based societies. What can markets do? Well, they lead to at least these 3 things: poverty, unfairness, and inequality. And if that's the case, why would anybody support it? And in fact, we had a forum just last night on Wake Forest campus for Congresswoman Virginia Fox, who represents the 5th District, and she's running for re-election, as you may know. And one of the students in the question and answer session asked effectively that question. It said, well, these are the things that capitalism does. How can you be someone who supports markets and commercial society? So what I'd like to do today is to give you 3 reasons that might try to address this question. How can somebody, or why would somebody support a commercial society? I'll give you 3 potential reasons, and here they are. Well, if you care about poverty, fairness, or equality. You see what I did there? Now notice that those are moral arguments, and I would like to make a moral case, and I'm not talking about efficiency, and I will say that one of the mistakes I think many economists make is if they're going to try to make an argument for markets or a market-based society, if you start with efficient allocation of resources, you've lost the argument, especially with young people, with millennials and students. Their eyes glaze over when you start talking about allocating resources. Now that doesn't mean they shouldn't pay attention to that, but they don't. They're much more interested in the moral case. So let's see what we can make. So if these are three of the main moral concerns that people have, let's address them. So let's start the case with poverty. Now let me show you something. This is to show you, so my PhD is actually in philosophy, but this is to show you that even philosophers can make graphs. Let me tell you what it is you're looking at there. So that is, over the last 12,000 years of human history, the total economic output of the world divided by the number of people who were alive at the time. Okay? So you see there's a blue line and a red line. Those are just two different ways of calculating it. The blue line goes back to year 1. The red line goes back to 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years ago. In fact, the red line is from an economist at Berkeley who actually makes estimates going back to 1,000,000 years ago. That's a bit dodgy, early hominins on the planet. But we do have pretty good data going back to about 10,000 BC, because that's when human beings started to engage in agriculture. And when they began to engage in agriculture, they kept records. So we have, this belongs to you, this belongs to me, we traded this, so we have some records. So I want you to just take a look at those very long, low lines. Now, if you're a social scientist, what part of that graph is going to leap out at you as being the most interesting? It's what changed. So if you think about, just run your mind's eye back through some of the great civilizations in human history. So think of the pharaohs when they built their pyramids. Not a blip. Think of the Roman Empire. Not a blip. Think of the Song dynasty in China. Nothing. And then what happened? Around 1800 or so, in one backward corner of the world, something began to change, and then we have quite a hockey stick, don't we? So the interesting question is, and maybe you have your own theories about that, and there are people who have various theories about what explains that hockey stick, that trajectory upward, but there's no controversy that that did happen. So the question is, what caused it? And maybe you have your own theory about it, and maybe you're already starting to suspect what I'm going to suggest, but something interesting changed in human history. And just to give you an idea of why this matters, some of you may remember from your undergraduate days, you remember Thomas Hobbes and his book Leviathan. He's a great English philosopher. This is one of the more famous quotes in basically all of political philosophy, but this is what he says. And he wrote in 1651, "The life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Well, in 1651, he was right. That is the life of human beings. Before 1800, the average person alive in 1800 was no better off materially than the average person alive in 100,000 BC. Just think about that for a second. There was no change. People's lives did not change. And in the United States, the average life expectancy in 1800, does anybody want to take a wild guess? What was the life expectancy at birth in 1800 in the United States? This was right after the ratification of the Constitution, right after the creation of the United States. Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah, 39. 39, ladies and gentlemen. Just think about that for a second. Maybe you remember, have you all read Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet? Do you know how old Romeo and Juliet were in that play? 13. Kind of creepy, isn't it? Well, if you're only going to live to 39, you better get going, I guess, right? And I dare say there may even be some people in this room who are at 39 or above. So before 1800, there was no change. Then things began to change, and for that entire long, low red line that I showed you, in contemporary dollars, the average person lived on between $1 and $3 per person per day. That was it. Never changed. So it's remarkably consistent, remarkably low. I mean, you think about, could you live on $3 per day? I mean, could you live? Maybe. But do you have more than one pair of shoes? You're already out. What about today? Worldwide today, it's $47 per person per day. That's in constant dollars. In the United States, it's $163 per day. So what kind of increase is that? That's a 16 times real increase in human prosperity worldwide, and 54 times in the United States. So the average person alive in the United States today is 54 times in real wealth, times wealthier than the average person alive in 1800. That's a pretty remarkable change. So as I say, as a social scientist, what you want to know is something pretty dramatic happened. What was it? And I'll just point out one other thing. So there's an economic historian named Deirdre McCloskey who wrote in 2016, she's got a long series of books she's been writing about this. She says the average person alive in the world today is about 100 times wealthier than the average person in 1800 when you account for things like infrastructure and when you account for things that didn't exist in 1800 like antibiotics and the internet. So a couple of years ago, an economist friend of mine at Southern Methodist University started polling his students, and he asked them, how much would it take for you to give up the internet for the rest of your life? So how much money would you want to never go on the internet again the rest of your life? Well, you might be able to imagine what students said. They said, well, I want $100 million, $1 billion. They said all of these crazy things. But here's the interesting part. What was the next question he asked them? He said, well, how much are you yourself personally right now paying to get on the internet? And what do you think the answer to that was? Nothing. Who pays for it for them? Their parents, Starbucks, the university where they go. They're not paying anything. So something that they themselves value at $100 million or more, they get for free. Now, it's very hard to reckon that kind of value into these numbers, which is why when you consider things like hidden wealth like that, it might actually be 100 times wealthier. So here's my question, and this is a sort of philosophical but also an economic question. What caused this big change? What is it that caused it? Now, here's what I would like to ask you to think about. There are really two ways to exchange things, aren't there? So suppose I say, well, I see we have a very nice iPhone. I don't know if that's an iPhone here. Suppose, Mike, you've got a very nice iPhone. Suppose I say to Mike, I'd really like to have that iPhone. Be a shame if anything happened to it. There are two ways I could get that from him, aren't there? What are the two ways? What's one way? Buy it. Oh. I like how the first thing you said was stealing. Okay, so I guess one way I could get it from him, I could kill him, I could steal it, I could defraud him, I could say I'll give you $10,000 in 2 weeks, and then he gives me the phone and I just run off with it. That's one general way to get something from somebody else. What's a different way? I could make him an offer, couldn't I, that he's free to accept or not. And if he accepts it, then we exchange. So here's my question to you. So if we call the first group extraction. Extraction is what goes on when I just take wealth from other people. Now, who benefits from that? Well, I certainly do, but the other person doesn't. In fact, economists call that a zero-sum exchange. So if I steal your phone, that's plus one phone for me, minus one phone for him. Plus one plus minus one is zero. Zero sum. So there's no increase in net wealth. It's just moving it from one place to another. That's what happened with the pharaohs. That's what happened in the Roman Empire. How did the Roman Empire get all the wealth to build the Colosseum and all the things they did? By enslaving people and conquering lands and stealing their stuff. That doesn't increase overall wealth. It just enriches some people at the expense of others. That's extraction. This other way we might exchange, we might call cooperation. That's where somebody makes an offer that the other person is free to accept or decline. Now let me ask you, here's a trick question. Suppose you have a cooperative exchange like that. So you go into Starbucks and you order your double pumpkin spice mocha latte, and the barista says, well, that'll be $5. You give the barista $5. The barista gives you your drink. Which one of you benefited from that exchange? So this is an audience of business people. The answer is both. Now, I challenge you, ask your random millennial about that, who benefits, and they'll say Starbucks. And it's true that Starbucks benefits, but so does the person buying the latte, and how do you know? Because if they didn't, they wouldn't have bought it. That's the difference. That's not a zero-sum exchange, that's a positive-sum exchange. So Starbucks valued the $5 more than the latte, otherwise they wouldn't have sold it to you for $5. You value the latte more than the $5, otherwise you wouldn't have paid $5 for it. So if you voluntarily exchanged, that means that if you both benefited, it's a positive sum exchange. That, I think, is what's going on here. So what happened, to explain that hockey stick, is a transition from the primary way human beings dealt with each other throughout almost all of their history, being extraction, to cooperation. Mutually voluntary, and so mutually beneficial transaction. and then the institutions of what we might call justice. Now, if that seems obvious to you, that people should be protected in their persons, meaning you can't kill them, you can't enslave them, you can't molest them, they're protected in their property. If it's your property, I can't steal it, I can't defraud you out of it, I can't trespass on it without your permission. And your promises, if you and I make a voluntary agreement or contract, we keep to it. If that seems obvious to you, that was pretty revolutionary in the 18th century. So almost nowhere in the world would that have been the conception of justice that anybody had. But that began to take root, and as it began to take root and spread, that's what began to increase the number of positive sum transactions that people had, which began that upward trajectory. So here's my moral question for you. Between extraction and cooperation, which one of those ways of dealing with other people is more moral? Yeah. Well done. So that might seem obvious to you again, but I want you to appreciate just how radical that is, especially viewed from the perspective of human history. How many past civilizations believed that you needed to get other people's permission before you took their stuff? That may seem obvious to you, it may seem obvious to us today, but for an awfully long time, and there are still some parts of the world today where that doesn't go on, where some people claim the right to be able to take other people's things, to infringe other people's persons, property, and promises without their permission. Okay, so that's been talking about money. Now, is money the only thing that matters? Some of you aren't so sure. Is money the only thing that matters? So my argument would be no, money is not the only thing that matters. But here's what I would say. What wealth can do is enable the other things that do matter in life. The things that enable people to lead lives of meaning and purpose. If I'm worrying about whether my children can eat today or whether I'll be able to eat today, then I'm not thinking about will I send my children to Wake Forest University, because I'm thinking about can we eat today. But what wealth can do is to address our more immediate pressing concerns so that people can begin to turn their attention to other things that fill out what it means to lead a life of meaning and purpose. And it turns out that empirical investigation, we've done a lot of work on this over the last 40 or 50 years. And for full disclosure, I'm one of the people who does this empirical research. Commercial societies track positively with a lot of the different ways that we've been able to figure out in trying to measure human well-being. So if you think about what kinds of things matter in a human life. So here's a list of things. There may be others. Life expectancy, infant survival, child nutrition, etc. Literacy, look on the right side. Political stability, life satisfaction. This is self-reported life satisfaction. Civil rights and democracy, even environmental protection. In every single one of these dimensions, they track positively with commercial societies. In other words, the more your country is based on a market-based society, the higher you rate on every one of those things. In fact, it's extremely difficult to find anything that we can measure that doesn't follow that same pattern. The higher you are, the closer you are to having a market-based society, the more your citizens enjoy all of these kinds of benefits. Now, you may remember from your college days, correlation is not the same thing as causation. These are correlations. So are they causations? Well, that's a subject for debate. It's very hard to figure out, to pinpoint causal mechanisms, especially when you're dealing with human beings, because you can't put human beings in controlled experiments. They don't like that very much. So we have to look at correlations. But when you have this many correlations that all point in the same direction, every one of those is with statistical significance, that begins to look like you're building a pretty strong case. Okay. So what's the upshot on caring for the poor? Human well-being consistently tracks positively with private property rights and competitive markets. The stronger private property rights are, and the stronger your markets are, the better your citizens will chart on all of those features of well-being. There are just some examples. Compare mainland China to Hong Kong, etc. And I want to emphasize that this isn't merely about money. It's enabling people to lead lives of meaning and purpose. If you look at those pairs of countries, Venezuela, Chile, Cuba, and Miami, China, Hong Kong, North, South Korea, the difference between the citizens of those countries is not just how much money they have, but whether they can lead a life of meaning and purpose or not. So I think this is much more important than just how much money is in your bank account. Okay. So that's poverty. Now I only have a few more minutes, right, Benton? You're a taskmaster. What were the other two? I'm just going to mention something briefly about the other two. So if you care about, so my argument is, if you care about poverty, then you better think pretty hard about a market economy. But what about these other things, unfairness and inequality? Let me just say something briefly about each of those. And here's where I'm really going to try to offend as many people as possible. So there is a position in political philosophy called luck egalitarianism. That's a mouthful, luck egalitarianism. What is that position? That position says luck plays a role in everybody's life. Some people have good luck, some people have bad luck. But luck, by definition, is not something you deserve. It's just something that happens to you. So some people were lucky enough to have good parents, parents who loved them or created a loving household. Some people were lucky enough to have been sent to good schools. They got a good education. Other people didn't. The luck egalitarian position is that because luck isn't something you deserved as an individual, it's just something that happened to you, a gift given to you, or not if it's bad luck, then you can't claim to deserve it. And so if you have success in life because you had a lot of lucky things happen to you, good luck, then at least some proportion of the success that you have in life is not due to your own efforts, it's due to the luck that you had. So maybe what we should do is redistribute some of the fruits of the success of the people who've had good luck to people who've had bad luck. So we want to equalize the effect of luck in people's lives, hence this term luck egalitarianism, equalize the luck. Okay, so that's the position, and that's an objection to market-based societies on the grounds that people say, the luck egalitarians say, that what happens in markets is that people get rewarded for luck. They also get punished for bad luck, and that seems unfair. So maybe what we should do is try to equalize the luck. So here's my proposal for you, and this is where I'm going to try to offend you. So here's my proposal. Suppose you have undeserved bad luck. So you have bad luck, and we all agree that you didn't deserve it. And at the same time, you're disappointed by what happened, and we agree that it's reasonable. You should be disappointed. If we were in your shoes, we would be disappointed too. Let's suppose you have both of those. I'd like to suggest that that still doesn't mean anybody owes you anything. Okay? All right, I have one person in my corner. All right. So some people will argue, some lucky egalitarians will argue that if you have either undeserved bad luck or reasonable disappointment, then you're owed some kind of compensation. I want to take a harder case. Even if you have both, doesn't necessarily mean anybody owes you anything. So here's my argument to suggest this. So I wanted you to consider two students at Wake Forest whose names have been changed to protect the innocent, Jack and Jill. So they were seniors in March of their senior year at Wake Forest. They're both economics majors, and they've been dating for some time. And Jill, for her part, is starting to think that maybe Jack is the one for her. And Jack is starting to think that maybe Jill is the one for him. And so now they're getting close to graduation. They're starting to think, well, should we coordinate what we're going to do after graduation? One Sunday evening, Jack calls Jill, and he says, Jill, I'd like to take you out to dinner next Saturday night. And she says, great. And he says, it's going to be special. And she says, it's going to be special? And he says, it's going to be special. And she says, okay. So she hangs up the phone, and she says to her roommates, hey, Jack just asked me out to dinner next Saturday night. He says it's going to be special. You don't think he's going to ask you to marry him, do you? And they say, he is totally going to ask you to marry him. And so you can imagine the thoughts she starts to have. What will I say? What will I do? What will my life be like? She starts writing her name on things, Mrs. Jack, to see if she likes it. She decides that if he asks me to marry him, I'm going to say yes. Okay? Now Jack, for his part, when he hung up the phone, he calls a restaurant and he says, I'd like to make a reservation for my girlfriend and me for dinner next Saturday night, and I'm going to ask her to marry me. And they say, oh, that's fantastic. It'll be beautiful. We'll have somebody with violins. It'll be great. He says, thank you very much. Okay. That's Sunday night. On Monday, Jill is in class. Jack is at a jewelry store buying an engagement ring with his student loan money. Don't do that. No. He buys an engagement ring. At the same time, Jill's in class, and she's not really paying attention to class because she's thinking about what might be happening. She's on her way out of class, and as she's on her way out of class, she gets stopped by Joe. Now, who's Joe? Well, Joe's a kid who's been in the class the entire semester, but she hadn't really noticed him. And Joe says, hey, Jill, I missed what the professor said at the end of class. Did you get it in your notes? And she says, let me check. And she looks at her notes, and she looks at Joe, and there's a spark. So they chat for a couple of minutes, and Joe says, hey, you want to go get a cup of coffee? And she says, sure, I didn't have anything else. There was a midterm review session, but I don't need to go to that. Sure. So they go get a cup of coffee. Turns out they spend quite a bit of time talking. They talk all afternoon. They miss all of their classes. Joe says, gosh, it's already almost dinner time. Would you like to get a bite to eat? And she says, oh, she looks at her watch and says, oh my gosh, I can't believe all the time's gone by. Well, I was supposed to go visit my grandmother who's in intensive care, but I'm sure she's fine. Yes, let's go get something to eat. So they go and get a bite to eat. After eating, they continue talking. They walk the quad, they go to the library, they talk, they stay with each other all night long. The sun is coming up over Wade Chapel on campus. Joe looks at the sun, he looks at Jill, and he says, I can't believe what I'm feeling and thinking right now. I've never met anybody like you, Jill, but marry me right now. Let's go to Las Vegas and get married right now. All of a sudden, Jill snaps out of whatever reverie she had been in, and she realizes she spent all this time with somebody who was basically a stranger to her. She looks at her phone, and she's got 78 texts from Jack and her friend. Do you remember Jack? Where are you? Are you dead in a ditch somewhere? And her mind starts swirling, and while she's thinking all of these things, she says yes. They get in the car right then, and they drive all the way to Las Vegas and get married. Okay. So there's my scenario. I want you to think about that for a second. And now I want you to think about poor old Jack. Did Jack have some undeserved bad luck? Is that kind of bad luck the week you were going to ask your long-term girlfriend to marry you, she happens to run into somebody with whom she decides to elope? That seems like bad luck. If Jack is pretty, I heard that. Dodge a bullet, is that what you said? If Jack is disappointed by that, would you agree that his disappointment is reasonable? Sure. But my question is, what can Jack do about it? So is it a bummer? Yeah. If you're a friend of Jack's, should you give him some help? Should you take him out for a beer and say, that's a bummer, Jack? Sure. Might you introduce him to somebody else? Here meet Jenny. Sure. Here meet Jerry. I don't know, it's 21st century, I guess. Okay. But well, he hadn't given her the ring yet. But could he sue Jill for future compensation for future affection that he intended to get from her? No. How about suing her for the 9 children he wanted her to bear him? No. And why couldn't he do any of those things? The answer is because Jack had no right to Jill. Jill is a free person. She gets to make the decision she wants on her own, and even if that disappoints people, even if it's as a result of luck, that's just what it means to live in a free society in which we respect other people's right to make choices. So we can't sue her. That would be ridiculous. And now how does that relate to markets? I would say the same thing goes on in markets. If you're the owner of Coffee Shop A and I go there every day, and then all of a sudden right across the street from you, Coffee Shop B opens up, and I try it out and decide I like it better, and I go there instead of going to your coffee shop, and maybe everybody who used to go to Coffee Shop A goes to Coffee Shop B instead, is that bad luck that a coffee shop opened up right across the street from you that people like? Yes. If you're disappointed that your business isn't doing as well as you wanted it to do? Yes. Does that mean you should be able to do something about it? No. The reason is for exactly the same reason in the other case. You have no right to other people's resources or to patrons. If they decide to go somewhere else, you can try to change your services, you can work hard to win them back, but if they say no, that's their right. I'd say it's the same in both cases. Did I succeed in offending people? All right. One last thing I want to say, now this is a little bit more fun. Does commercial society lead to inequality? Are there some people who have more than others in commercial societies? Yes. Okay, so here's my question for you. Should we care about that? Does that matter? Let me give you a quick thought experiment. Suppose we have 2 people. I don't know if you can see, it's kind of small. 2 people, A and B. I'm not going to tell you anything about them except one is wealthier than the other. A has more money than B. Okay? Let's raise the stakes. Let's make it 10 times. A has 10. I'll tell you what. Let's make it 100 times. A has 100 times as much wealth as B. Now, without knowing anything else about them, would you say that a society in which one person can have 100 times as much wealth as another person is inherently unjust? So is it a failure of justice, or maybe you feel like a failure of social justice, for one person to be able to be worth 100 times what another person is worth? Well, while you're thinking about this, and imagine while you're thinking about your own position, also think about how your children or grandchildren might answer that question, how my students might. Let me tell you who my A is. Here's my A. Do you recognize him? Who's that? That's Bill Gates. There he is, thanking God that he lives in America. As of today, Bill Gates is worth about $90 billion. That goes up and down with market returns, but what's a billion among friends? It's about 90 billion. Who's the poor person who has to make it through life on only 1/100th as much wealth as Bill Gates? This is somebody I'll bet you'll recognize. Who's that? Michael Jordan's only worth about $900 million, which is 1/100th of Bill Gates' wealth. Now, there was a time when Bill Gates used to actually publicly say, I could buy Michael Jordan 100 times over. This was sort of when he would try to say geeks are better than athletes, this sort of thing. He doesn't say that anymore, but he used to say that. So now this is an extreme example, obviously, but what is that supposed to show? Here's what I think matters. The question that matters is, how did they get it? Did somebody who has wealth get it through force, get it through fraud, deception, in other words, through extraction? Or did they get it through positive, some mutually voluntary and mutually beneficial transactions? That's what matters. And the other question is, you also, I think, have to look at the absolute quality of life, of an individual's life. Michael Jordan may only be worth 1/100th as much as Bill Gates, but I think he's doing pretty well by any objective standards. So relative to Bill Gates, he's extremely poor, but relative to the rest of the world, he's doing just fine. So you have to look at the absolute condition as well. But suppose you're skeptical. In the United States, are there people, is there an even bigger differential than 100 times? Yeah, so let's raise it by an order of magnitude. Suppose you had somebody who had only 1/1000th as much wealth as Bill Gates. Or raise it 1/10,000th. 1/100,000th. Let's make it even bigger. Suppose you had somebody who had only 1/180,000th of Bill Gates' wealth. Now, surely that's somebody who's going to be living a poor, miserable life. Who is that poor soul for whom we should have sympathy? That's me. Actually, not quite. I'm rounding up just for. Okay. Now, what question, more serious question, does that raise? Suppose you had it in your power to solve one problem in the world, but only one. Would you solve poverty or inequality? Now, I want you to think about that, because what the empirical evidence suggests is that that might actually be the situation we are in. Because the institutions that we've been able to figure out that enable people to rise out of poverty at the same time also allow for differentials in poverty. On the other hand, the institutions that we know that can keep people relatively equal, they can be equal, but they're equally poor. So it seems like that's the real choice we in fact make. And I think your answer to that question, poverty or inequality, might go some way towards explaining your own view about what system of political economy should we have. Okay. So let me conclude with one last little point here about equality. Market societies allow for a great deal of material inequality, but not necessarily moral inequality. And that might even be, this is a famous passage from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. You may remember this. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, brewer, or baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Now, when you hear that, do you hear selfishness? Do you hear him advocating selfishness? We should be selfish, only care about yourself? Maybe. That's what Karl Marx thought. So Karl Marx, the author of the Communist Manifesto, read Adam Smith, and he said, yeah, there it is, the smoking gun of capitalism. It's right there. It's all about number one. And maybe, I don't want to prejudice your own interpretation of that, but that's not quite what Adam Smith thought that he was arguing for. He was arguing for something quite different, and that's respect. In other words, what that means is when the person you make an offer to has the opportunity to say no thank you and go elsewhere, then the only way you can actually execute a transaction, execute an exchange, is when both of you benefit. And if you're trying to sell somebody to something or get a customer or get a client, the only way you're going to be able to do that is offering them something that matters to them. So who do you spend your time thinking about? Them. So the business person who's spending his or her time thinking only about me, what's in it for me, 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 you're going to go out of business fast. And I probably don't need to tell you what keeps CEOs up at night, what gives them gray hair. It's thinking about employees, customers, clients. It's everybody else that they're trying to keep, trying to please. not only themselves. And that implies a different kind of equality, an equality of moral agency. You meet people as peers. Bill Gates can make you an offer of any amount of money, but you always retain the power, if you like, to say no thank you and go elsewhere. That makes you moral equals, immediate moral equals. Okay, here's my conclusion. What do we get from markets? I tried to make these 3 points. What do we get from markets? We have had unprecedented material prosperity, and because of that opt-out option, that moral equality, a respect for other people's dignity, I would argue. So what we get is not perfection. Perfection is not on offer in this world, I don't think. But what we might get, and what we have gotten, is increasing material prosperity, and we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So think, oh, by the way, there's the cover of my book. Thank you for mentioning my book. I was hoping it would be available by Christmas, so you can get it for Christmas gifts, but it's going to be January, unfortunately. But I explain this quite a bit more in detail in the book. If you have a system of political economy that leads to increasing prosperity, and at the same time respects people's dignity, then it seems to me that that might be a good case for what we might consider to be true social justice. And with that, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
And we're about out of time, but I have a sneaking suspicion that Dr. Otteson has no classes this afternoon up at Wake Forest. And so please feel free to come up. I'm sure he'll stay around for a little bit. We've got a board meeting down in Studio 2. Be thinking about Cuba and folks that we might approach to see if we can find a home for him. And thank you for coming today. We'll see you next week. We're adjourned.